Welcome to the Town Builders Podcast. I'm your host, Levi Wentz. Town Builders is produced by the NTBA, the National Town Builders Association, implementers of the new urbanism. Find out more at ntba.net. This podcast is sponsored by James Hardie, what the best are made of. James Hardie is America's #1 brand in siding. Their product is elegant and durable and is sure to elevate any building or development. So if you want to find out more, go to jameshardie.com or find them at your local building supplier. Hello, friends. Today on the Town Builders Podcast, I'm happy to be bringing you a conversation with Laurence Qamar. Laurence is the founding principal of Qamar & Associates and one of the most thoughtful town planners working today. Based out of Portland, Oregon, Laurence has over 35 years of experience as an architect and urban designer, helping bring new urbanism to the Northwest while shaping communities like Seabrook, Vista Fields, Bella Beach, all the way to Woodbury, the project I'm working on here in Idaho. In this episode, we get into the role of the town planner and Laurence's own pattern of town planning that creates building blocks or blocks of blocks that can be interlinked and scaled up or down based on the size of the land being developed. He calls this scales of community, and it helps towns develop an organic pattern of growth that is both interesting and natural. We also dig into some of the practical stuff, the real economics of urbanism, alley-loaded blocks, what makes a place walkable, and using the transect as a design tool. Now, one thing to note, we do pull up some visuals later in the episode. We tried our best to describe them as clearly as we could for the audio version, but if you want to follow along, the full video is up on YouTube. Just search Town Builders and look for the episode with Laurence Qamar. Now, this is a rich, wide-ranging conversation with someone who spent a lifetime thinking about how to design better places. I'm grateful to Laurence for the time. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did, and thank you for listening to the show. Laurence Qamar, welcome to the Town Builders Podcast.
Well, thank you, Levi. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's a real pleasure to be having you. I'm very excited because, first of all, I consider you a friend, but also you're a big help in being the town planner at Woodbury, which is the development me and my dad are working on. And so I've been familiar with your work. So really excited to have you on and be able to share your ideas and designs with a broader audience.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, first off, one of the things that I wanted to get into, we've had a town architect on recently. I've noticed we kind of breeze through some of these terms that people seem to be familiar with, but we just go through them. And I've realized that I define them differently in my head than how other people define them. So I'd love to hear from your perspective, the role of a town planner.
Certainly, yeah. No, you're right. These terms are all relatively, in my understanding, relatively new to the new urbanism world. Town planner, town architect, town founder. I don't know, do you and Mark Wentz refer to yourselves as town founders?
I'll let him take the credit on that one.
All right. Yeah. Well, my understanding is that these terms, this program very much trained the town planner how to design and the economics of it, the philosophy behind it, the multidisciplinary profession of planning, of town planning. Different than, it's very closely related, but it's different than the conventional land use or transportation planner. It involves transportation, it involves land use, but it's a very different career path I've found to conventional APA planning. So it really builds around the process of looking at the history of the planning of towns and incorporating that into contemporary. That program in particular, it had a funny name. It was the Masters of Architecture in Town and Suburb Design. The suburb part always throws people because, well, why are you designing suburbs? I thought it was a great deal of what the CNU town planning is about is an alternative to the suburb. Well, it isn't. It isn't an alternative as in we completely reject the suburb. The suburbs are part of the process of where we need to be developing communities in a coherent, walkable way.
The suburb is suburban. It's a geographic location, but we have a negative connotation because they've all been designed poorly. Is that correct?
That's a good way to put it. The suburbs can go back in ways to the 19th century and earlier, spreading out from a central city. It's the mid 20th century era of suburban expansion and suburban sprawl, auto-oriented, highway-oriented, actually very much ingrained in the whole transportation planning ethos of the mid 20th century and modernist planning, transportation planning and land use planning, in which the segregation of uses, the segregation of people, and the expansion of cities along highways that went out from the core and in many ways drove the highway through the middle of the city with one-way couplets and bypasses and drawing the lifeblood out of towns and cities, not intending to do so, but it all relates to the expansion that caused white flight out of the cities and those highways that enabled people to leave the city but come back in to their offices in the downtown. That really gutted a lot of downtowns. So the town planner is not only about designing greenfield new neighborhoods out in the suburbs or in the, at the edge of the city. It's also the revitalization of downtowns, of cities, of neighborhoods, and how to create a cohesive, walkable, mixed use neighborhood, be it a village in the countryside or be it within the city, the revitalization of existing old neighborhoods, and also the retrofitting of suburban sprawl into more walkable mixed-use places. Those are sort of the three tenets.
Right. So it's a holistic view and design approach to those areas. You mentioned in the University of Miami master's program that you looked at the philosophy as well as the economics and the economics. How does economics play into your role as town planner?
Well, that's complex. The economics, be it working with a city there, or the economics of how a city functions is quite complex. Folks like Joe Minicosi has a tremendous way of analyzing and defining the value of how inner city comprehensively compact development has a much better tax advantage to the coffers of the city, opposed to the cost of spreading out, of creating highways, creating new utility networks and systems. That becomes a much more costly way for a city to grow. From a private developer standpoint, in a lot of ways, it's clear that new urbanism is not inexpensive. It can be, though. It can be done in a more affordable manner. But we are changing policies. We're changing design criteria. I think with your experiences in developing Woodbury, you can see that, well, you're dealing with alleyways. Aren't alleyways more expensive because you're adding another street to serve one lot? Well, there's a fine analysis that could be done there. Actually, myself and Michael Mahaffey have done, I think, a very comprehensive analysis of the cost benefits down to the square feet of pavement, of driveways, of alleyways, of the width of the street, of the width of the lots that are facing onto that street. And we've created an analysis that shows that an urbanism that does have alleyways, but has to have a compact scale of lot sizes and housing, is comparable and can even beat the cost of doing conventional suburban streets, with cul-de-sacs and limited access, wide streets with front access into driveways and snout houses and garages in the front. That you can actually beat that system from a cost standpoint by using alleys effectively. So it's the narrowness of the street, the elimination of front-loaded garages for the majority of conditions. It's not that front-loaded garages are always inappropriate. They can be perfectly well done. The elimination of that driveway, though, is significant, and the addition of on-street parking, where you're storing more cars in parallel parking, in narrower streets, in queuing streets. We're talking about we're getting right into a lot of details here that, all the developers in the NTBA are going to be quite familiar with dealing with those issues of trying to get approval from jurisdictions to be able to change those standards.
Well, I think it's one of the most important conversations. So I wouldn't mind spending more time on it. So in talking about the economics, you first came at it from the city's perspective, and you brought up Joe Minicozy with Urban 3. They've done a lot of analysis about how the suburbs are subsidized by the downtown. And we've experienced this in our own city in Moscow, Idaho, where the city used to help developers develop the public infrastructure that went through neighborhoods. And I don't know at what point that switched and started rolling back, but now the developer has to put in all the public improvements. And now it's to the point even where we have a lot of suburban collector roads coming to Woodbury that are in really poor shape because the city hasn't upgraded them in years. And we, the developer, are having to go upgrade and spend our money to upgrade neighboring streets that touch into the development because the city doesn't have the money to properly maintain and upgrade them and do it themselves. And so because the city's
Offsite improvements,
significant amount of offsite improvements. And it's unfortunate that the cities are in these positions where it really hurts for us as the developer. I've also talked with the city manager and can be sympathetic in his case where he's trying to deal with balancing a budget as well. And they have infrastructure that costs a lot of money to maintain, and it wasn't developed properly. It wasn't developed with the economics in mind. Now, I think on the other side of it, as we develop infrastructure within our own development, the long-term payoff is important. But speaking from a developer's point of view, it matters a lot if we're putting up an extra $100,000 now for infrastructure or not, and that sort of thing. So where could people find that comprehensive analysis that you and Mike Mahaffey, because I think that would be really beneficial for cities, and for developers going in and bargaining with cities, as well as developers trying to make sense of a balance sheet and wondering if they can really pull off this type of design. The doubling up of roads, frontage roads and alleyways is a common thing that I've run into with people. It just doesn't make sense on the surface.
Well, the doubling of roads, I think what you're referring to is when a developer commonly will have a collector on the edge of their property. And then they will put a local street only 100 feet away from that road, backing up to the collector and facing into sometimes very often putting up a wall, a fence, a hedge, so that the development is blocked off from the collector. This is a really backwards way of thinking of the relationship and the connectivity of a neighborhood or a street. And the cost of that is extraordinary. The cost of the collector is significant, and now you're putting in a single loaded street inside that you otherwise could be facing those houses or end grading those houses out to the collector. And that has a lot to do with the functional classification system, the transportation system developed mid-century, Transportation Planning 101, in which every jurisdiction throughout the country has established that functional classification where there are virtually only three types of roads: arterials, collectors, and local streets, and ending in cul-de-sacs. And inherently, they most often require no on-street parking on those two higher levels of arterial and collector. The result is that nobody really wants to face their house to a collector that isn't a narrow enough street and doesn't have some on-street parking that will protect the pedestrian on the sidewalk. So much of this has to do with making a walkable community, a place you want to walk in, a place that you desire to walk. Jeff Speck's fantastic book, Walkable City, I highly recommend. He outlines that so clearly, how the quality of place, of creating communities, creating neighborhoods, fully depends upon the ability and the desirability of being able to walk in that community, to be able to live, work, shop, play, learn, recreate, all within a 5-minute walk of one's home is really the core of what we're driving at here, trying to make communities that have that sort of a close scale to them. And it breaks down when you hit the collector on the edge.
So I'm going to test your new urbanism, 101 on this, because walkability is this other thing that is talked about all of the time, but rarely do I hear it just defined in a conversation. Because as you pointed out, the highway running through town here. It has sidewalks on both sides. It's walkable. I mean, you can walk it. It's a perfectly fine sidewalk. But why is walkability held as one of those? It's always the first thing that people bring up as it relates to designing communities of this type. What is it about walkability that is so important to creating a beautiful place where humans want to be?
Well, these are some of the fundamentals. It starts with the social network of one with your neighbor that might be right next door, might be within 6 to 8 homes around your home, or might be the whole street or several blocks around you. If you're out on your feet, walk in the neighborhood and you have a destination to go to, it's an attractive environment you're walking through. It's safe, convenient, and interesting. These are the 3 core elements. Is it an interesting walk? Is it visually appealing? Is there change that goes on and variety? Is there a transect of different types of environments, be they rural to urban or a more mixed use core central part of the neighborhood or of a town, out to the outer edges, all within a 5-minute walk? That creates not a monofunctional environment, but a multifaceted environment that is engaging for people. But I think the social engagement, and there's an economic aspect to being able to walk to the places where you live and work and shop and go to school. The savings of, the cost savings of having only one car instead of 2 or 3 cars per family, because many, if not all, of your destinations are close by. And if they're not close enough, you can hop on a bicycle and you have a bicycle network or a network of streets that are calm enough to be able to bike in without even necessarily having to have bike lanes. And if you want to go beyond that, you have the ability to hop on transit within a 5-minute walk or less. And that's where we get into the 5-minute neighborhood versus the 15-minute city. And I won't go into the depth of all of that.
Town Builders is brought to you by Brett Jones, PA. Brett is a practicing land use lawyer in Florida and as a patron and advocate for new urbanism. He leverages his background in corporate law and personal development experience to help landowners and developers get entitlements and cut through red tape to build human-centric, walkable neighborhoods. Visit brettjonespa.com to find out more. Couple of things that you just noted there. The social engagement of having a walkable environment allows you to walk around and run into neighbors, and it creates there's more community that's created because people are running into each other on their feet. You run into someone in the car, that's not a good thing. So but creating those interactions throughout the day, the visual engagement of creating an interesting place that invites people to want to go walk around and explore. It's why people go to old neighborhoods and drive around or walk around just to look at good architecture. It's engaging and it inspires you, that sort of thing. And then there's also, I don't know, maybe what you'd call more of the physical engagement of a walkable environment, providing the sidewalks and the trails and easy access to places, as well as making sure that it's comfortable to walk around. There's shade. That'd be something that I'd point to on the highway is like you can walk along the side of the highway, but it's loud, noisy. There's no shade. There's nothing interesting to look at. It just feels hostile in every sort of way. So providing those shady tree-lined streets for people to walk down kind of serves that physical need that we have to have protection.
And designing communities with that as a fundamental basis is inherent in our human genes up until maybe the 20th century, but throughout human history, designing everything, that we live in, the landscape to the village, to the town, to the city urban neighborhood, always had to do with proximity, access, all within walking distance.
Right.
Or hopping on a horse.
Right. Well, that is the other thing, like I said, that didn't bring up is we're created as walkable creatures like that. We have certain limits and our legs are part of those limits. They allow us to do things. And then also, we don't necessarily want to walk more than 5 minutes or that sort of thing. So working within that scale, that's part of the human scale, I guess, is understanding how we operate as humans and the distances we can travel with comfort and ease.
And the health benefits to walking versus the health consequences that particularly Americans have an epidemic of health problems that
Right.
to a great extent come out of a sedentary lifestyle, hopping in our car to get most places. So just having that ability to get out and be in your community, be in your neighborhood. But there is also that aspect of true social ability. Like we develop networks and connections with people in many ways. Long distance sometimes is the way it is. We have means of communication that enable us now to communicate with people that might be quite far away. But having those close relationships right around us. Now, of course, Ross Chapin, who you interviewed recently and is a dear friend and colleague of mine, we've had a wonderful time working together at times in the past. He, of course, defines that sense of community, as I understand it, as small as 6 to 8 homes gathered around one another. And I won't go into describing, all of his approach and philosophy to the pocket neighborhood, his wonderful book that describes this and the work that he's done through these years in creating pocket neighborhoods. But it's really compelling how he approaches it. That's the seed, the smallest increment.
That's actually something that I wanted to ask you about because I think we had this conversation at one of the previous CNU conferences. But what we discussed in that episode with Ross and what he's done, as you mentioned, such a good job of is understanding the pattern language of the pocket neighborhood and how 6 to 8 homes relate to each other. He uses the example of the dining room table. You can talk to 6 to 8 people and everyone can kind of be talking. If you get more than that, then there's separate conversations happening at different ends of the table. And the one community you had starts kind of breaking into a couple different conversations. And so Ross has done just an excellent job at that. But I think one of the things that you've been able to capture as a town planner is thinking about that scale of community in the pattern language at the neighborhood or the town scale. Ross is really good at thinking about those 6 to 8 homes, and you've really made it your work to think about, okay, how does that expand when there's hundreds of homes involved? So can you talk about that and how the pattern language that you think about when designing a town and how you keep the proper scale of community?
Yes. And that there are multiple scales of community, I think is what we have to always recognize, that creating a larger community than just a pocket neighborhood of 6 to 8 to 10, maximum maybe 12 little houses clustered around a cottage green, or it could even occur in an apartment house. That's maybe the smallest increment, but it goes up to the block, the subsections of the neighborhood. And I could show you a diagram of this, but it's something that it's a patterning that it's a using the pattern language approach. It's a patterning of different scales that Michael Mahaffey and Ross Chapin and I have gotten together and discussed in great detail. And of course, this is really at the core of the new urbanism we've been led to understand through many years of working with new urbanists. And again, I have to look back to Andres Dwaning, Liz Plater-Zyberk, as folks that identified what Leon Creer was identifying, which is that quarter section neighborhood, that 5-minute walk that is about a quarter of a mile from center to edge, and that there are streets and passageways moving through that there's a center to that neighborhood that might be in the center or might be at the edge, that there are different layers. There's a transect of different layers of density and different types of houses and buildings that fit within that overall neighborhood, but that we can then break down that quarter section into what different people are calling different things. Ross and myself and Michael said, let's call the next layer down a sanctuary, and that's about a quarter of a mile square or an eighth of a mile radius. So about a 2.5-minute walk from center to edge. Smaller than that, I came to realize that about a 9 square of 200-foot blocks, which amounts to about 660 feet to 700 feet, somewhere in that range, is the size of the Savannah, Georgia ward. And can I show you some diagrams?
Yeah, certainly. I love that. Yeah, pull up some diagrams because I want to dive into your mind here and how you're thinking about these blocks and I love how you said multiple scales of communities building out. So of course this is a audio podcast, but we'll do our best to walk the listeners through. And if you want to see more, the podcast should be on YouTube as well. And you can see what Laurence is showing here, but we'll do our best to walk through it slowly and show you guys what we're looking at. So
we're talking about what's the different scales of community. There's a diagram I'm showing on the podcast for those of you who are not seeing it, but listening, I could describe it. It goes back to what I was just describing about that very simple concept of the quarter section, which is a quarter of a mile from the center to the edge of a walking pedestrian shed. And it fits very naturally into both the American township and range system of the 1 mile grid. This was established by Thomas Jefferson, spread across the whole West, except for the original 13 some odd colonies. And that quarter section, we like to break down into different scales. Now, we're not the only folks doing this. There's, many folks, in fact, Andres Duany and Korkut Honoran, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, have done a very elaborate and thorough notion of looking not only to what's larger than the 5-minute walking radius to the 15-minute city and all that, but what are the components that break down the quarter mile radius, the quarter section, and what are its component parts? We've given them names. I say we as in Michael Mahaffey and Ross Chapin sat together one day for 3 days, actually. We were working with a client and wanting to just come up with a way of encapsulating the basic concepts of creating and forming and designing an appropriately scaled series of communities that fit within each other, kind of like the Russian dolls. We call them the neighborhood. That's at the quarter section scale. A sanctuary, which is a quarter of that, and that's about 40 acres or a quarter mile across instead of a half mile across, which is the full neighborhood. The next level down from the sanctuary, we call the ward, and we're naming that right after the Savannah, Georgia ward, designed by Oglethorpe, a British commander in the 1600s, I believe. I have a slide regarding that. And then from that ward, which is, we like to call it a block of blocks. This is actually a term that we learned from Douglas Duany when we did a session together at a CNU back in 2019, talking about these scales of community and also the notion of mid-block passages, interweaving mid-block passages into a neighborhood that are pedestrian, that don't have cars. So those mid-block passages are ways you can go inside of a block or assemble a group of blocks, creating a block of blocks. And Douglas Duany introduced that term to me, saying that it was Leon Creer who uses that term. And of course, Leon Creer's work, who we recently lost to great sadness, is extraordinary in terms of the assembly of the town, the village, in those groupings of blocks that you can go deeper and deeper inside of. And then finally, from the ward, referring to the Savannah, Georgia ward, the court. The court is approximately the scale of the pocket neighborhood that Ross Chapin has identified for us. And that's roughly a 1-minute walk across, 1 to 2 acres, a 16th of a mile. So we go from a 16th of a mile to an 1/8 of a mile to a 1/4 of a mile to a whole half a mile across, and each of those fitting into one another.
How is it helpful? Maybe I'm getting ahead of you, but this, for those who are looking at this kind of looks, in some regards would remind someone of the transect view, we're getting in more and more detail as you slide down the scale. You also have, as another part of this diagram, the different streets that bisect in between each of these layers here. But what's the goal with breaking it down into smaller and smaller scale?
Good question. Thank you. How do we create communities at different scales? If I'm working for a developer, which is a great deal of my work, or working for developers with developers, they may have a site that's a small infill site. I mean, this is a lot of how Ross Chapin started his earliest pocket neighborhoods. Some of Duany Plater-Zyber's earliest work in communities, one in, I think it's Boca Raton, was pretty much relatively an infill project. And so you only have so much space. How do you create a network of pathways, of streets, circulation, the structure of the blocks? Where's the center? Where's the edges? How do you connect to the fabric that's around it? Now, if you've got a much larger site, 80 acres, like Seaside, Florida, or actually the original part of Seabrook, we haven't mentioned Seabrook, Washington, one of my most accomplished developments, or rather town plans that has been developed by Casey Roloff and the Seabrook Company, who you did a wonderful podcast of back recently. That started off as also about 80 acres in the original town center. It has grown to well over 400 to 600 acres. I've lost track, for that matter. And I've been doing an expanded plan of additional neighborhoods with each step. So that's part of the question is, does a community or a neighborhood just expand to as big as it gets? No, it has a relatively defined, not rigidly, but a relatively defined scale. And we like to say that's about a 5-minute walk because people will generally, on average, the average American will walk about 5 minutes to a destination. And so we put those oftentimes harder edges toward the edges of that quarter section. And there's a big debate about that, whether those larger roads are at the edges of the neighborhood or if they're at the center of the neighborhood, that is at the crossroads of larger streets, more regional streets, I shouldn't say larger, that creates centers and town centers where the commerce is fed by the traffic of those passing through and passing by, but also the concentration of residential around that.
Right. And the breaking down allows you to come to an infill site and understand what's the appropriate scale of something to infill here and tie into whatever remaining fabric there is around it, as well as in a situation like Seabrook, where the original plan keeps getting expanded. There's modules or patterns for how that development should continue, so it just doesn't turn into a really pretty sprawl or something like that.
Right. And when we do have a space, a piece of land that is larger than, let's say, 80 to 120 to 160 acres, which is the quarter section, then it's time to create a whole new neighborhood. We don't just spread that thing out and sprawl out, go lower density. We create a new neighborhood that has a new center, a new transect of most urban to more rural, that has a clear center, an identifiable center, but whose edges might be soft and amorphous, or they might be hard edges, be it a natural landscape feature, a corridor, a river's edge, an ocean's edge, a change in topography that might create an edge, or it might be a man-made transportation corridor,
Right.
a boulevard, an avenue, not an arterial or a highway, ideally, but something that is still an accessible edge, one that is permeable, that you can have access onto. And that's one of the problems I mentioned with the functional classification system in transportation planning, is that increasingly as you get larger in the size of a roadway, or they become stroads, as Chuck Marohn very beautifully described the combination of a road and a street, there's less access to it. There's inherently a limited access, the limited access freeway, for instance. And those become hard edges. They become not very friendly neighbors and edges to a neighborhood.
If I may, on that really quick, because I want to dive into the granular on this, but before we go that direction, I just want to take one more step back from the view that you're showing currently in this quarter mile section. The underlining presupposition here is that this is, you have your neighborhood laid out as the quarter section. Do you think that when you're talking about hard edges and the scales of community, the question begs, what's the next scale of community beyond this, and how do you continue to build these neighborhoods on top of each other? Do you think that the grid pattern that we have laid out is the best pattern to continue in development? We can really have these interesting corridors on the interior of the grid, but at the city scale, is the grid still the best layout?
Good question. The diagram that some of you here in this podcast are able to see that I'm displaying here does show the outer edges of these neighborhoods as being a rectilinear Cartesian grid. That's by no means preferable to an organic, meandering, more nuanced and relative to the landscape but there's nothing wrong with a hard gridiron. There, Manhattan is the core of Manhattan is a gridiron, the majority of it. Savannah, Georgia, which I'd love to show you all because it has some extraordinary elements to it, is a grid, but it has tremendous nuances within that grid. And a great deal of this diagram you're seeing here, and the notion of the ward, again, that's the eighth mile across, 10 acres roughly, comes right out of Savannah, Georgia. So neither is better, a gridiron versus an organic one.
Well, let's get into the Savannah ward. I'm controlling the slide deck here. Laurence, where would you like me to move next?
Roll on down. This is a piece of the Savannah, Georgia plan it's 1733 that Oglethorpe laid this plan out. So it's pre-revolution, American Revolution. What you're seeing here are a series of greens. Have you ever been to Savannah?
I haven't been. No, it's on my list though.
It's a beautiful place. I mean, the CNU was there back not many years ago, and it was extraordinary to be there. But I had been learning about the Savannah Plan, in particular from Andres Duane, way back when I was in the graduate program at University of Miami in the early 90s. And yet I never understood the depth of how rich this plan is. You're seeing these greens that are squares that are the centers of each of the wards. Again, the wards are, as I said, about 10 acres. They're an assemblage of about 9 200-foot square blocks, let's say, with streets and passageways between them. If you were to want to move through the city, like you're on a nice date, and you want to take a beautiful stroll through the city, you would walk from one of these greens in the center of each of these wards to the next one. You could go north, south, east, west, and you'd come into these incredible rooms within the center of that. I call it it's an outdoor room. We often refer to this as we're creating outdoor rooms. Streets are outdoor rooms. You'd be walking into the center of each of these squares that have incredible trees draping with that long moss at the south, but also beautiful building types. There are little tiny passageways of alleyways going through some of these blocks. But you'd walk from one square to the next. You'd cross over a bit of a busy street at the edge of each of those wards. In my observation, they were mostly 2-lane streets with on-street parking. Not much wider than that. There's a couple of boulevards that go through with a large center median that go through the heart of Savannah. But for the most part, those crossings from one ward to the next is pretty simple. You walk into the next ward, you walk into the next ward. It's beautiful. It leads all the way down to the river. Now, if you wanted to get through town quickly, you were driving or you were on horse and buggy and you wanted to really move fast, you would definitely not go from one center of a ward to the next center of the next ward. You would go on the straight streets that are running perfectly rectilinearly in between the wards. And they're not big, wide streets again. They're not noxious. Today with automobiles and buses, they're not at all noxious or loud or smelly or dangerous, but there are clear, direct ways to be able to move through the city. So the ward is a really important concept. It's much, much larger than Ross Chapin's pocket neighborhood of 6 to 8 units or 12, 10 to 12 maximum. Much, much larger. But it's an increment that's in between.
And you said from the center of a ward, still trying to get the scale down here, the center of a ward to the outside is 2.5-minute walk?
Yes, I believe that's the scale. If we were to go back to my previous slide, which we don't need to, I have that all measured out.
So for the audience just listening, there's a grid laid out here with greens in the center. There's maybe 18 of them all together, kind of a 3x6 grid with a green at the center of each of these squares. Now, with the Savannah ward, how does this is a great pattern to lay out. Is there uniqueness within the ward of mixed use centers, shopping? What's the culture within a ward itself? What's the community like within that scale?
In my experiences of Savannah, Georgia's wards, my recollection is that there were restaurants and beautiful cafes that were looking out into the greens, and that there was probably that kind of like a softer environment facing inward to those greens than out on the edges.
Okay.
Where there would be other kinds of retail that's feeding more off of the larger traffic of the movement economy
Right.
on those streets. But it's all mixed in with residential in a beautiful way.
So it's hyper mixed use. On the inside of the ward and on the exterior. The inside is maybe kind of your social type restaurants and cafes and maybe boutiques, and the outside of the wards where there's more travel is, as you said, auto oriented shopping.
Now it's auto oriented.
Yeah, but a little bit more trafficked. I want to take a moment to talk to you about one of our sponsors, Harvey Points. Harvey Points are architectural designers that have worked on new urbanist projects nationwide. With a blend of bold ideas and thoughtful design, they have experienced site planning everything from infill projects in pocket neighborhoods to master planned communities. During the site planning process, they develop floor plans that tailor fit to each lot, giving you a comprehensive plan to take forward. They also provide realistic 3D renderings that help the whole team visualize the project from early stages, as well as being a great tool to get city planners and council members on board to approve your new development. We all want to see more unique communities built, and Harvey Points would love to assist you in that pursuit. Visit their website, harveypoints.com. That's Harvey with a B, or follow them on Instagram at Harvey Points.
If you're to move to the next slide or the next couple of slides, you can see different aspects of this. Is another diagram of the same. And I actually have put onto it scales that I've drawn these red circles. And so the ward is 1/8 of a mile across.
Mm.
The sanctuary is an assembly of 4 wards, and the 1/4 mile radius, or half a mile from edge to edge, is an assembly of 1, 2, 3, 4 wards by 4 wards.
You have like 18 in there.
Yeah, 16 or so, but there's a very large park in the midst of that as well. That isn't necessarily a ward. But I use these scales as I'm assembling a neighborhood. And I've been increasingly, through past years, creating these blocks of blocks where there are passageways going in between what otherwise would be an assembly of 4 to 6 to maybe as many as 9 little blocks. And instead of there being full-blown streets inside those blocks, they can be these very slow-moving, meandering, narrow lanes, or they could actually be pedestrian-only streets. Now, this isn't anything new that I've created. I'm just following, again, everything I know, a great deal of what I know, I've learned from my mentors and my professors and my employers in the past, Andres Dwani and Liz Fuller-Zyberk, and the whole DPZ co-design is extraordinary wealth of knowledge about how cities are designed and assembled.
We're looking at very old plans here, 1733, but I think a lot about what we're doing is trying to rediscover this and how do we get this implemented today?
Yeah. And that's really just what all of the town planners and the town founders have been doing, is looking back into history and finding great precedences and bringing them updated to this time.
Yeah.
And how do you fit the modern aspects of living? I don't want to use the word modern, but the contemporary way of living, 20th and 21st century, by using these precedences in smart ways.
Right. And we're not trying to create a certain lifestyle of saying you can't have cars at all or this sort of thing, but it's trying to create spaces for people, for humans to be able to walk, to have something different. And I like how you discussed in the previous slide those rectilinear streets that cut through on the edges of wards. So if you need to get down to the river quickly, you can get down to the river quickly, because guess what? Throughout people's days, we're all moving around, and some days, some people have to move faster than other people and have things get done. And so how we work out these plans, it needs to serve people and their different capacities of what they're doing as well.
Sometimes we want to meander. Sometimes we want to get there relatively quickly.
Right.
And this is a beautiful way of approaching it. So I'm increasingly, in all of the plans that I'm working on and I'm creating these days, and I've been doing this for many years, and I've instilled some of this into the Seabrook plan that I started devising as early as 2002, a good 4 years before the groundbreaking. I've been implanting this approach of making pedestrian-only mid-block passages. And that mid-block passage concept, there's different ways of doing it. I mean, the pocket neighborhood does it beautifully. You find a little tiny grouping of a green in the middle. It comes from the English close. It comes from I have got in this presentation that a lot of people won't be able to actually see, but we can describe aspects of it. I have examples of how mid-block passages meander through Berlin, Germany's beautiful honeycomb of courtyards within blocks. It's a pattern established in the late 19th century. It looks very, very different than a Ross Chapin pocket neighborhood here with a beautiful green in the middle and a group of cottages wrapping around it. But it's the same pattern. So it goes back to that notion of the pattern language by Christopher Alexander, that a pattern doesn't necessarily mean a specific form. It's a relationship of design elements that are composed in similar ways and yet can be very different and maintain that common pattern below.
Well, I'd love to look at can we go to some of your plans and see how you've worked in this idea into some of these plans that you've worked on?
Yeah, if you just drop to the next slide right below the one you have there, this is the design of a little cottage court that I did back in probably this was somewhere around 2006 or so. This is at Seabrook, and it's a little cottage court with about a dozen houses around it. It cuts through a block. It has alleyways on the north and the south, and it's called the Alder Court. There are two Alder Courts, South Alder Court, North Alder Court in Seabrook. And they're little 2-bedroom cottages that are in the middle. And at the ends, they're bookended with a 3-bedroom house that's 2 stories. And it's a beautiful little enclosed space in a very short depth from one street to the next. So you can, as a guest wanting to visit one of these homes, you can park your car on the street on the edge and you can walk in only about 50 to 75 feet to get to anyone's house. The alleyways in the back provide access for parking for the units themselves. But what's important is that this little pocket neighborhood cottage court connects to another one, connects to another pathway. So if you were to go to the next slide, you can see this one piece of Seabrook in which there's a whole string, like a necklace, where I've connected up one little cottage court that passes through going from right to left. The little cottage court that we just looked at, one of the Alder courts, goes through a little passageway that's only about a 6-foot wide path, cutting through a block, comes to the large crescent park, and then it dives into another block of blocks where the houses, 4 houses on each side, are facing into this greenway. You can see the photo on the bottom left here, which we simply dug out. Stephen Polakis, an extraordinary landscape architect, urbanist, who originally came from his work in his younger days at Rosemary Beach, and then came out and started working with us in the mid 2000s. He designed this beautiful little greenway here where he put wetland paths after having dug out a simple trench that became a stormwater management basin, and then put these little footbridges across it. Great little space. And you can see in the bottom right corner photo how that entire greenway runs all the way back into this neighborhood. So linking them up. And again, look to a place like Rosemary Beach that Dwayne Plater Seabrook planned many years ago, I believe in the 2000s, or maybe it was in the mid 1990s to late 1990s, I think. A beautiful network of these cottage courts that are mid-block passages, very much like this, that I learned this technique from.
Well, and what I see in looking at this slide here, so we zoomed back from the cottage court to a bigger site plan of a portion of Seabrook. You can see that passageway through the court meanders all the way down to the beach, which I would assume is a place that's popular for people to walk to. And what it looks like, it's like a migratory pattern for humans, but it's just kind of, as you've mentioned, meanders through the neighborhood, but it looks natural. And you've just kind of shaped people and given them an opportunity to get all the way down to the beach, in a relatively straight shot, but it's kind of this meandering line through. And I can also see just, you don't have these drawn, but there's these patterns running every sort of direction through the plan.
It's very clear how to move through these neighborhoods, but it still involves a meander. It's organic. And it has nothing to do with the rigid gridiron that some of my earlier diagrams was illustrating this in.
Right.
So again, back to your question, what's better, a grid or a meandering path? No, both are just fine. They're great examples throughout history of each of those sort of patterns.
Is there another slide here that you'd like me to pull up?
Yeah, just down below, the next one below that shows you some of these spaces running through Seabrook. They're just pathways, beautiful paths that houses are facing onto, or greenways, or fireplaces in the middle of these cottage courts that people gather around. And this is a block of blocks, or a mid-block passage that I believe this illustration was designed by Chris Ritter, who's done beautiful, beautiful series. I just heard him speaking at the last CNU in Providence, Rhode Island, saying that he and Andreas Dwani are putting together a book of all of these block studies that they have done and that Chris has beautifully designed and rendered through many years, in which he's doing exactly this, creating these internal mid-block realms that very much can be connected up. And so there's a lot of folks that are increasingly following this methodology of creating streets that work on the outside of a block of blocks, and then these incredible environments within the block. Mm. And it's a very rich place to sort of mine design ideas from. So if you go a little further, you'll see some projects that right there. This is Vista Field, a project that myself and Michael Mahaffey have done in collaboration with Dwani Plater-Zyberk as the leads. For many years, we've worked, I think we started this probably around 2012. It's been a long haul of designing and the redevelopment of this 103-acre old airfield in Kennewick, Washington. And we're in the process of building out the first neighborhoods here, the first housing. And it's actually a similar approach to not creating greenways necessarily, but Wunnerfs that are linked up with one another. So there's very little actual street network in this whole plan, but it looks like there's lots of streets. They're actually Wunnerfs. They're pedestrian only or pedestrian dominant with some allowance of cars to be able to move through.
So what would be the difference then of a Wunnerf versus a green space or a street? How do you work those into a plan? How do you see them different?
Yeah, a Wunnerf is a Dutch term describing a street passage that is usually pretty narrow, that the car is a guest in instead of dominating. The Dutch really have done a wonderful job of creating streets like this that are, for the most part, residential, although they just as well could be a mix of uses of commercial. And you can drive through, but you have to drive through very slowly. It's primarily a place where furniture falls out into the street space. People sit in the street. There's gathering places, in the midst of the street, and maybe a way that you can make your way through in a car. But for the most part, you decide, let's go to the next street over that's meant to be driven on. And it's, in that sense, it's very much like the Savannah Wards, where you can drive around and through the Savannah Ward, around the square, the amazing squares of Savannah. But for the most part, you want to just keep going on an adjacent street.
Right. Absolutely. You kind of played this design out at Woodbury, so I've been able to become very intimate with it. And it was a great transition for me and my dad as well, because particularly my dad was a fan of Ross Chapin for a very long time. So I was familiar with the pocket neighborhood, and we had actually practiced our work on a couple pocket neighborhoods before undertaking Woodbury. But you came in and you designed these linked. It was fun doing the pocket neighborhood and finishing that up, but it always felt it was kind of a cul-de-sac. It's very limited. The community, as you mentioned, was limited to that. And so I'm really excited to be able to link these scales of community together. There's different neighborhoods that you can meander through, and you've created a really great cyclical pattern there with alleyways and trails, as well as trails cutting north, south, and east, west. And I haven't spent the time to count up the miles of trails within those 80 acres, but there's certain to be a lot.
Right. Woodbury is only 80 acres. Is that?
Yeah, 82 acres.
82 acres. I think that's precisely what Seaside, Florida is, 82 acres.
Oh, really?
Maybe it's 80.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. There's so many, as you mentioned, Seabrook was originally 80 acres as well, and it is the perfect scale to be able to work at that neighborhood scale.
Well, if you wanted to roll down to the slide of Woodbury, this actually has quite a range of very small lots in the middle. And we were just discussing before we started this that we're moving into actually adding in more townhouses right around the central green.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to even get smaller and tighter out to some significantly larger lots to the east in particular in the light tan. But it's meant to be very much of an organically formed village sitting out in mostly the open landscape of the Palouse, where you all are out in Moscow, Idaho.
Right.
But those passageways that you're talking about, there is that central green in the middle, the largest of them all. And then there is a block of blocks to the north of that has a central green in the middle of it, and a block of blocks to the east, to the south, and the west, and a network of greenways and pathways that go from the center of each one of those. So I would say each of those 4 blocks of blocks is comparable to the Savannah Ward. You see the comparison here where
Right.
there are streets going around them, but there are no streets going right through the center of them. There are only greenways through the center with alleyways that are backing up those lots.
Right. And it's cool to see this view where this is very curvilinear versus the Savannah Ward that looks like it was like an army encampment at some point. I mean, the lines are so straight there.
That's pretty funny. It was an army encampment.
Oh, it was? Okay. I actually didn't even know that. But I mean, it looked like it was drawn by a general or something, the original plan. But it's cool to see that the same pattern, as you said, can work in different forms.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I want to correct that. I'm not positive it was considered an army encampment. I think that Oglethorpe was a general. It must have been fortified. But I'm not sure to what extent it was an encampment, much like Greek town planning and the Roman towns of very early era were actually encampments. The Romans set out the Cardos and the Decumanus, the crossing of the 2 main streets in the center of the camp. And that became the main and main in the center of those towns. And the grid would spread out around that. So very much the same patterns from Roman encampments.
The other thing that, I just point out here that I thought you'd done so well, and we just made mention of it, is with the 80 acres, where Woodbury is located, we're tying into sort of R1, almost quarter acre lots that are surrounding the development into countryside on the other side. So we wanted to get to that mixed use neighborhood business zone at the center of it. And so each block that moves inwards covers a different portion of the transect in one sense. Each block that continues gets to smaller and smaller lots. So we move from kind of estate lots down to single family cottage homes, townhomes, and the neighborhood business zone with apartments above retail pretty quickly. But I think the scale is going to work out well to do that.
Yeah. No, you bring up a really important point that this is at the edge of Moscow's suburban fringe. It has large lots to the south and to the west. And to the east, it's the open farmland of the Palouse. So this is creating a center to those existing neighbors, larger lot neighbors.
Right. Right.
And who knows what the city of Moscow will do in the future. Maybe they will allow and enable some of those larger suburban lots to infill with new housing. As many cities here along the West Coast and other parts of the country are allowing single family housing, single family zoning to now have multiple units infilling, more than just putting an ADU, the missing middle concept of a variety of different kinds of housing that are compatible with one another from a form-based standpoint, where you can't even tell if there's 4 units in that house or if it's just one big house.
Yeah, there's so many great examples of that in town, of old mansions that have been converted into apartment buildings. And yeah, you could never tell if that was the case. I think the last thing that we'll point to this before we sign off is whether it's Woodbury or another development. This is on the edge. Hopefully it becomes a new center, but certainly not the end of development. And I think what's important is I've seen a lot of master plan communities that start to, from an aerial view, look like cul-de-sacs, on cities and growth. They work on themselves, but they tie into nothing else, and there's one road that goes out to them. So the hope with Woodbury and the rest is that it can be a center of new development. Whether we continue developing beyond the borders of this, or eventually the city will get to developing beyond, and it needs to tie into the rest of that. Hopefully we're creating a fabric and pattern that can continue out beyond our plan, and that the plan itself is not insular.
Yeah, exactly. And that when there is a further growth, that it's a growth of new centers, so that you're creating a polycentric city, a polycentric region. And those centers, whether they're small centers or large centers, and anywhere along that range of the scales of community in that diagram, you could continue to build. The next center size up might be more than just a neighborhood. It could be a whole town that is assembling the lower density parts around it and giving a center to suburbia. That's one of the sort of key notions of retrofitting suburbia, is to create a center out there so that what's already out there can be inoculated in a sense.
Well, that's wonderful. Laurence, I think that's a good place to end it. So thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom with us. And it's great exploring some of these ideas. Before we sign off, would you mind just telling people how they can find you and follow along with what you're doing?
Qamar Architecture and Town Planning is my website. You can take a look at that. I'll admit it's a little bit of an old website, needs some updating.
Wonderful. Well, Laurence, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening.
It's been a great pleasure talking with you. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Levi. And thank your dad, Mark.
I will thank him as well. Have a good one, everyone.